Okay, so we get a mid-sagittal section of the brain, right? I'm going to use the model because it's easier to take this apart than one of the actual brains here. We can look at a number of discrete and important structures. So let's take a look here. And I kind of wish I could get the lighting better here, but that's as best I can do is like this. So once again, here is the most rostral or anterior end. This is the frontal lobe, right? Here is the most caudal or posterior end. This is the occipital lobe. Here would be the parietal lobe up here. And the temporal lobe you can sort of see jutting out below in here. This portion right at the front is called the temporal pole. And then you can see a pretty significant and critical region of white matter, right? This is actually the corpus callosum, which is the axons that are connecting neurons that are found in, this hemisphere with the neurons that are found in, the cortex of the other hemisphere. There's a lot of, hemispheric communication via that corpus callosum. And then we have this very important gyrus right here. This is the cingulate gyrus, which we're going to see as a component of the limbic system. And the anterior cingulate's a really important region for, coupling detection of how the body feels, what's going on in your body, with, what it is you're going to do and think about and plan for and prepare. So very important sort of limbic region of the brain. And then we have the brain stem, right? So the brain stem includes the lowest, the lowest, right? I mean, of course, the most caudal end of the brain stem. This is called the medulla. Some people say the medulla. Then there's this kind of bulgy portion right here. This is called the pons. And then up here is called the midbrain. And remember, the brainstem is the source of a lot of, kind of ascending projections from nuclei that are going to be releasing, the modulatory neurotransmitters sort of elsewhere around the brain. You can see also a structure that's localized right in this little kind of triangle right in there. This is called the hypothalamus, and it's connected usually, and I lost the actual little gland. There's a tiny little stalk that sticks out of here, and then there's our little kind of rounded gland called the pituitary gland. This is called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is, many of its nuclei are around the ventricle, around a ventricle, so they have access to CSF. They also have projections like neuronal, projections that go into the bloodstream, and they can detect aspects of what's circulating in CSF and what's circulating in the blood. They also get lots of sensory inputs, about the temperature of the body, about, the amount of glucose in the body, all sorts of aspects of, the internal environment of the body, what's referred to as the internal milieu. And then the hypothalamus has kind of outputs, from these various nuclei that make it up, to change the body and alter the body and, get the body to some extent back into some sort of homeostatic balance, right? Sometimes they call it allostatic. Allostasis just means that there's a variable state. Under certain circumstances, the body should be in a fight or flight mode, for example. In other states, it should be calm and more relaxed. So there are, for some things, it's like the pH of the blood is very precise. It must be homeostatic. It must be the same all the time. But in other cases, you want some ability for variability, right? But basically, the hypothalamus has three main outputs, that allow it to influence your body as a whole. It can provoke the release of chemicals called hormones from the pituitary gland that can then travel throughout the body in the general circulation and impact the functioning and activity of tissues all over the body. There's a very famous kind of stress response, right? The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis, where if there's stimuli that are perceived as stressful, the hypothalamus will release a chemical into this little blood system that connects it to the pituitary, which will then provoke the release of a hormone from the pituitary, which will travel to the adrenal glands, which sit atop your kidneys, and provoke the release of adrenaline, or, as we also learned, right, epinephrine, and that can provoke, and other kind of hormones, including, cortisol, stress hormones that can really generate, powerful sort of stress responses. The hypothalamus also has direct control over the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic output. So it can influence the parasympathetic output from the vagus nerve or the intermediolateral cell column in the spinal cord, which is the origin of primary output for the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And finally, it can project, and we're going to see that the structure just above the hypothalamus, called the thalamus, is a really important structure for initially processing sensory inputs before sending them on to areas of the cortex. Well, the hypothalamus is, detecting sensory afferent aspects of the internal environment, the internal milieu, and it's going to communicate that to the cortex, where you're going to be able to deploy, sort of more complex, sort of networks that are involved in perception, and sort of conscious decision making, right? And so it's going to send projections from the hypothalamus to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus into this anterior cingulate gyrus. And this anterior cingulate is an important component of various networks that are involved in perceiving aspects of the body and tying that to motor and behavioral and decision-making responses. So when you have like not much water, you have too many salts, right? There's a nucleus in the hypothalamus that'll detect that you need some water. It'll provoke the release of hormones that will cause retention of water in the kidneys. It'll possibly alter your autonomic balance, but it'll also communicate via the thalamus to the anterior cingulate, and you will feel thirsty, and you will be motivated and driven and look around for things that have water in them. So the hypothalamus is a really important sort of master kind of control node in terms of autonomic and hormonal and also sort of behavioral response networks in the brain.